Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of BIM Pure Live. I am your host, Nicolas Catalier. I am an architect and the founder of Revit Pure and BIM Pure. And we have a great guest for you today. We're going to talk about Skema AI. But before getting there, this season, let me just show on the screen. Yeah, there we go. So this is the season of BIM Pure Live for the spring and summer of 2024. You can see we have a list of 5 great guests. And the entire season is sponsored by Enscape, part of Chaos Group now. So thanks, Enscape, for sponsoring. Let me just play the little roll. So actually, Enscape just released the version 4.0, and I'm always thrilled that they're sponsoring because they make my job very easy because I'm a long-time Enscape user, and I love this tool. I've been using it. It changed my life. When I was in college trying to do renderings, it used to be tools such as FormZ, and would have had to stay awake the whole night to keep track on my renderings. And now with Enscape, it's so much easier. And I've tried a lot of rendering tools. There's many of them that I like, but in the end, I often return to Enscape because of the simplicity. And now with the new version 4.0, they have new people and assets. They have the NVIDIA denoiser. They have the timeline animations. They have new VR headset support. And they have better Revit work sharing compatibilities. So if you're working with central models, it should be faster and easier to work with Enscape. So thanks, Enscape, for sponsoring the season of BIM Pure Live. And meanwhile, in the chat, people watching live, if you're on May 22nd, 2024, and you're watching live, you can type in where you are watching from. Already, I can see Bert from California. I see Michal as well in the chat, frequently watching the live show. Just give me a sec here. And this is bimpure.com. This is our membership website to learn BIM and Revit. We have a collection of Revit courses, basics, design, manage, hierarchic families, downloadable files, such as templates, Dynamo scripts. We have BIM master sessions with a new one coming soon. And something brand new, we're releasing the first version of our Revit doors collection. If you go to bimpure.com and you click here, you can see there's a little video preview where we cover all the features included. And this is released this Monday on May 27th. So pretty stoked. We've been working hard on these doors to make them simple, user-friendly, and efficient. Looking forward to the release. And these doors, it's all available at the same price point. If you are a BIM Pure subscribers, you get access to all the content. It's as simple as that. And the price is $348 per year to get access to all of this. And next week's episode is going to be with Howard Vasog. Howard is one of the most honest person in BIM that I know. He has lots of interesting ideas. And this time he's going to come back on the show to talk about his company, Anchor, to create and validate BIM data on the cloud. This is next week. And this show is at noon Eastern time, so 3 hours before to accommodate for European times. So next week at noon, 12 p.m. Okay. Give me a sec here. Let's have a quick glance at the chat. We've got Jeff from Michigan, Ali from El Salvador. We've got Emilio from Uruguay, Benjamin from Portland, Liz from Boston, Hayden from St. Louis, Tila from Switzerland. So hello to everybody watching live. Thanks for tuning in week after week. And today's guest is Marty Rozmanith. Marty is based in Boston, Massachusetts. He has a degree in architectural engineering and an MBA from Boston University. And something interesting about Marty that I want to talk about, he used to work at Revit Technology Corp before it was acquired by Autodesk in 2002, if I'm not mistaken. Then he worked at Dassault Systems. And last year, he co-founded a company called Skema AI. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So let me bring you Marty. How are you doing, Marty?
Hello, thanks, Nicola. Great to be here.
Thanks for accepting the invitation. So I want to ask you about how did you end up working at the Revit company when it got started?
Uh, I love telling these old stories. So I was employee number 26 at a company called Charles River Software, which was what it was called before it was called Revit Technology Corp. And I was a product manager at Autodesk before that for a product called Architectural Desktop that was the modeling software of choice prior to Revit. And really the people funding Revit picked up my card at a trade show and gave me a call and said, you should come see what we're doing. And that's how I decided to join their team. It was clear that they had some very smart people and they knew how to do some things that were pretty special. And there was a great team there, so I decided to take the chance when nobody knew that would turn into what it turned into, and so that was a great experience. First off, doing it, it was also crazy because you hit a hockey stick like that, and it's very fast growing, and sometimes it's once in a lifetime. Hopefully, for me, it'll be a couple times in a lifetime with what we're doing now. But that was a great experience, and really proud of what it's been able to accomplish. Certainly now it's over 20 years old, and there's plenty of challenges still left to solve out there.
And so I see that you studied both business and architecture. How did you become in kind of the tech side of our architecture and the programming
Mm.
side of it?
Yeah, so when I was in college at Penn State, my degree was in architectural engineering, which is a combination of architecture studios and engineering coursework. So I practiced in both structural engineering and architecture practices. At the time, I thought I was going to get licensed in both. So I sat and passed 8 of the 9 exams for the architecture license. And I passed the EIT for the structural license because there were people who had come out of Penn State that gotten licensed in both. And it was sort of like an integrated practice dream at the time. But what I realized was that going into technology at that time in the early 90s was going to be far more impactful than staying in design and designing buildings. So after about 6 years of doing professional practice, I got hired by Autodesk. And one of the reasons I got hired by Autodesk was as part of just my professional activities, I was the co-chair of the computer forum at the San Francisco American Institute of Architects chapter. And so we would have a graphics competition. And one of our sponsors was Autodesk. So we would give away a copy of AutoCAD as the grand prize for the graphics competition. And from that, the folks at Autodesk Marketing got to know me and realized when they had made this acquisition of this company called Sofdesk that they needed someone with a technical understanding of of how computers are applied to architectural practice to come help them figure out what the use cases should be for it. And so I ended up being the technical product manager for Architectural Desktop before leaving for Revit. So that's the origin story of at least my career, and um, yeah, super happy it happened.
Yeah, for sure. So I think you recognize that using code is a way to leverage your career and have a bigger impact, right?
Yeah, and part of the reason I decided to get the MBA was after Autodesk got acquired, because of the cross-functional training that I had. I was really a lot of what I had studied around that time was how to take design data and leverage construction process. So I had, prior to getting the degree from Penn State, I had been on a framing crew in construction, building buildings, right, and laying out buildings in the field and understanding how field processes worked and being in job trailers and stuff like that. And so part of what I was really interested in is how could data on the front end of the process and design help the actual delivery of construction on the back end design? And that turns out in hindsight to be a really complicated question. So after Revit got acquired, I was trying to advocate internally at Autodesk for building some of these things that could help with pre-construction, only to find that management really didn't understand what I was talking about, and that I didn't have the vocabulary to convince people running a large corporation to take a risk on investing in something that wasn't necessarily done before and was a visionary thing that might lead somewhere. So I ended up, after leaving Autodesk, going and getting the MBA only so that I could get that vocabulary, so that in the future I would be able to explain to people why this was a good idea, not only from a, you know, idea and vision standpoint, but also why it made financial sense for them to invest in such a product. Because I found that lacking that vocabulary was a real impediment after the acquisition of Revit at Autodesk. And that's turned out to be a pretty good decision. I've been in a lot of startups after Revit got acquired, and then before I worked at Dassault Systems, and that's been an invaluable lesson. And I can tell you that you learn far more from the things that fail than from the things that succeed. So you're going to take your knocks along the way, and I've taken my share of knocks, but I think a lot of those learnings go into, you know, everything that you do next. So much of that has gone into Schema and what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah. So from what I've seen, you've worked at Autodesk, then at Revit, then Autodesk acquired Revit. You worked
Yeah.
there for a while, and then you went out to Dassault Systems.
Yeah.
What were you doing there?
So after working at Revit, I had done a number of startups trying to solve the construction delivery problem. I was at a company that had figured out essentially how to rebuild the Gulf Coast, from a technical standpoint and a labor standpoint, and another company that was taking Revit models to try and do CNC fabrication of steel structures. And what I ran into was an understanding that the industries that make things are not organized the same way as construction, and that construction with craft labor is really 100 years behind where the automotive and aerospace industries are. And so one of the as I was doing those startups, I got a call from an old friend of mine who I'd known from that time in San Francisco when I was working in architectural practice, who called me up and said, Dassault is creating a team to go into the AEC market. And I knew that Dassault was a leader in all these other manufacturing industries. And so I thought, well, if there's a company with a great technology stack to solve this organization of the construction process, it's probably this company. So at the time that they were creating the team, they recruited me to be part of that team. And so I became the sales and strategy director for AEC at Dassault that way. And that was back in 2012. So I did that for 10 years. And that was a really great platform to be, because my role was global. So I could go to Europe and see all the best practices in Europe. I could go to China and I could see everything that was done on buildings in China, on civil projects like railroad in China, go to Japan, go to all of these places, and really see what everybody was doing with all the different tools and all the different workflows, only to realize, you know, that it's even deeper than I thought it was. So, you know, be careful what you wish for. But Dassault was a really great company to have that experience with. We, I think, did a number of very, very innovative things at Dassault Systems to promote productization of construction, industrialized construction, and DFMA. And I still think that there's a really great technical solution in the Dassault platform for that. What I think, though, is that in order to get from where we are to there, we need some on-ramps onto their superhighway. And so that's part of, I think, what we're trying to do at Skema is interface with what's there today without necessarily, I'm not really interested in disrupting everything. That's one way to do things. I'm more interested in eliminating a bunch of things that don't have value so that people can concentrate on other things that do have value in either their own practice or in however they want to serve the owner. So that's really kind of the way we think about it. And then Dassault's been good about that because Dassault has a very holistic view of what it means to design and deliver something. And they've done this in many other industries. So applying it in our industry is really interesting. And I made some very good connections with people who really think about the problem differently, not just from the old geary guys who had done it with some previous versions of CATIA, but people who are doing it today in very innovative prefab and assembly driven kind of ways.
So fast forward a few years, and now you co-founded this company called Skema, and we were chatting before the show, and you told me that some of the code has been there for 6 years, but you
Yeah.
just finalized the papers to get this company going in late 2022.
Yeah.
So you're going to show how what Schema is and how it works, but can you tell us about the origin story and what problem
Yeah.
you were seeing and you were trying to solve?
Yeah. So when I left the I didn't realize I was going to do this, honestly. I had same guy who recruited me to we've been in professional practice together, and he had a background in commercial property development. So we actually had a real estate project, and we said, you know what? We're tired of not building stuff. Let's buy a piece of land as commercial owners and build ourselves a mixed use apartment building. And so we said, yeah, we'll go do that. And from what we learn, we'll sort of eat our own dog food and demonstrate to some people in the industry or what best practices could be. And we didn't know whether we were going to use the Dassault software. We did understand that there were an awful lot of innovative web-based software for trying to figure out real estate feasibility. Plenty of things that could figure out apartment layouts right out there. And some of those were US companies, some of them were Australian companies, some were European. And so we decided that we would, as an owner of the land ourselves, create this as a test bed. And so my partner in this was a licensed architect, and we had done a lot of work in software. So we just said, look, let's just try and apply this ourselves and see what we come up with. And we applied all these tools. We hired an architect out of a Boston firm to help us design these, because even as a lawyer, you need to hire your own lawyer. So even as architects, we need to hire an architect. So we hired this architect to help us, and we tried to use all these tools that were out there, these web-based tools that had gotten funded by venture capitalists, to do this site. And the site was an urban site in central Massachusetts. It had, like 20 feet of slope from one corner to another. So it was going to require a fairly complicated parking podium, and it wasn't a square site. It was, it was going to require a parking podium that was a trapezoidal shape and laying out and lining up the structure above for the apartment building. So it wasn't just some cookie cutter thing. And what we realized was that none of these pieces of software that got funded by these VCs could do it. And we ended up just doing the whole thing in Rhino, right? Our architect was like, it's just faster if I do this in Rhino. So we did it in Rhino. But one thing is we recorded the entire process. And so we started calling up these companies. And one of these companies, some of these companies I had talked to when I was at Dassault, because they were interested in Dassault getting into this market. But one of these companies we said, look, we'll send you the Zoom call of what we recorded when we were laying this thing out, where we eventually had to abort and go into Rhino, and you can look at it and see why your software failed. And so a few weeks later, we had a call with these guys in Eastern Europe, and they said, well, we've been thinking about what you're trying to do, and so we remade a new front end to what we have, and they showed us basically a very early version of Skema. And so I said, I remember these guys from talking to them before. They really understand how to convert stuff to Revit data, because they had built some configurators that are in use by sort of major US construction companies that do certain building types today. But those configurators they have to solve 100% of the problem, and they're going to be very limited in the inputs you can give them. You give them the inputs and they spit out an output, and that's the way they work. And one of the things I realized from Dassault Systems, working with lots of different companies trying to solve this problem, was you need flexibility, because architects want to be creative. They want to be able to do stuff. And there's been a lot of attempts at configurators. And every time I ask one of the people creating that configuration software, how do the architects like it? They go, oh, they hate it. Because they don't want to think about modular, volumetric, or any of that stuff. They just want to be able to design a building and not have the thing get in their way. And so, basically very early on, we said, these guys know what they're doing. They understand how to turn things into Revit data. And we think there's a lot of value in, using a front end tool that can then put out good Revit data. And this team in Eastern Europe had built these configurators, and they had basically made these prototypes. And when they would build a prototype, they would sell it to a company, and they would build another prototype and sell it to a company. So they had a lot of good technology, but they didn't really have a solid way of understanding how to take it to market. And so, we started having these discussions with them, and basically convinced them, look, we were the ones who took Revit to market. We kind of understand how to take stuff to market in this. So why don't we become partners? But we'll have to rewrite a whole bunch of your roadmap, because it's the product isn't solving the right problem. And so let's rewrite the roadmap, and then we'll take it to market with you. And if it gets traction, then we'll, join up, form a company, and we'll have a company. And that's exactly what happened. So we took it to market. We launched it at the American Institute of Architects last June. we got great press. We got some really serious accolades because of the way that it works, which is pretty different from everything else.
Yeah,
And then
would you say it's a, you mentioned feasibility tools. Would you consider it this way?
what tool? A
Like
feasibility tool? Yeah,
feasibilities.
it is absolutely a feasibility tool.
Okay.
But it's not a feasibility tool like Forma, where I mean, it
Hmm.
does have massing tools and it does have analysis tools and site tools, and it is a the original that very early version of Schema that they showed was something designed for urban master planners. But one of the things I said was there's not enough urban master planners to make a successful company. I mean, you can make a product for that, but it has to do something else just other than being an urban master planning product. And so we got into this idea that what the real challenge in early design is solving the partie so that as you mass things up and you see how the things that you are making in the place that you're trying to create, because especially in the urban context, you're trying to make a place. And a good place has lots of different axes of measurement. I did some work at Lend-Lease when I was at Dassault Systems where they would have, I think it was between 40 and 50 independent measures of what makes a good place. And those were scoring systems they would use for their mixed use projects. And so just the urban design problem of making a good place is complicated enough. Turning that into a pro forma and a partie that actually solves the owner's financial constraints at the same time is a pretty big challenge. And so there's a little bit of art to it. And so if you try and just do it procedurally, like with something like Grasshopper, you always end up with these edge conditions that aren't part of your script, right? And then people say, well, throw AI at the problem. Well, that's not as easy as it sounds. And so we figured out just ultimately you have to have a big idea, and we figured out that the big idea around this is to basically implement something that was described in the book Refabricating Architecture 20 something years ago at the same time Revit came out,
Okay.
which is
What book is
to
that?
design things in chunks.
What is this book? So if people
It's a
wanna,
book. So there's a firm in Philadelphia, I believe, called Kieran Timberlake, and the founders of
yeah.
Kieran Timberlake put out this book called Refabricating Architecture that described how other industries that make things make them, and that they don't make them the way we make them in construction. They make them by organizing things in tiers and making assemblies and prefabricating them and then bringing together at final assembly so they have the minimum amount of joints. And they describe this as designing things using chunks rather than individual parts. And through that, you can speed up the time, increase the quality, and lower the cost all simultaneously, which is sort of the trifecta that nobody believes in construction. They always think you can only
Yeah.
get two out of those three, but that's not true. You can get all three, but you can't
Hmm.
use the current approach if you want all three.
All right. So I know that you have a few slides. I'm getting very curious to see what Schema can do. So if you want, if you're ready, I
Sure.
can
Yeah,
move on to so we
absolutely.
can see your screen. There we
Yeah.
go. So we can
In some
see your
cases, I've
slides.
been thinking about this theoretically for a long time, but sometimes I need to show some pictures so people can follow along with what I'm
Yeah,
saying.
yeah, yeah. Sure.
Um, you know, when we did Revit, the big thing in the market was AutoCAD, right? And AutoCAD's big idea was basically take what you do on a drafting board and put it on a computer, right? So what I would do with vellum and a T-square and pencils, you turn that into a 2D program that draws lines, arcs, and circles, and then you plot it out on a plotter. And I did plenty of that in my time. And when we were going to do something that had a better workflow so that we could coordinate the construction drawings, because really what Revit was invented for was to make coordinated sets of permit drawings. We had to come up with a different metaphor. So we just used this idea of a cardboard model, this stretchable cardboard model in the computer that if you had to move a door, you just moved it in the cardboard model. And then if that was displayed on 50 different drawings, you didn't have to go and separately update 50 different DWG files. You just did it once in Revit, and then Revit would propagate it to all the drawings. And that was the big idea behind Revit. What it meant was that, rather than drawing lines, arcs, and circles, people in a tool like Revit, and it's not just Revit specific, it could be ArchiCAD or any other BIM tool, you're entering points and you're laying out walls and you're drawing floors and you're dropping in doors and you're dropping in windows and furniture. And basically you're picking points and dropping things in. And that's what you're doing like 8 hours a day when you use one of these BIM tools. And so for us, that's kind of at the data level. You're putting things in a place that has an XYZ, and we are inferring relationships from those. And Revit knows how to build the cardboard model. And that information is stored in objects and thus building information modeling. And that's sort of down at the bottom level of this graph, where the users are entering data, we're storing what that means as information in the objects, and then you may or may not have an API that you use with Dynamo or something else to go and grab that information, do something with it, and do something else with Revit or any other BIM system. Schema is sort of built on top of that. For us, we take Revit data as input, and we look at, all right, there's a bunch of walls, doors, and windows, but what is the layout that they're organized in, and what does that mean? So we capture something from that we call the graph. But what it really means is that we don't solve the design problem with individual walls, doors, and windows. We have whole chunks of the building. And it turns out this is the way that senior design principals think about it. They think about an apartment building as the number of apartment units and of what type. Somebody doing a hospital thinks about, this hospital has to be 200 beds. And then what are all the ratios of support spaces to support 200 beds? And if you're going to do a school, you're thinking, oh, well, I'm going to have 4 grades and each of them is going to have a certain number of students. That requires this many classrooms. And so then what are all the support spaces for a school that has that many classrooms? And you find that this is actually a very common pattern when you're dealing with building design, that in order to solve the partie, you need some organizing principle for what is the main point of the partie, and then everything else supports that organizing principle. And that's really the way that we've designed Schema to work, is that the chunks match whatever the organizing principle of the partie is. And we have that very explicitly in Schema. But the nice thing is that since we take those chunks from some previous Revit project, whenever you organize a new design in Schema, we can then produce the Revit data that would have resulted from you just straight doing it in Revit, except you don't have to spend weeks doing it in Revit. We can do it in a couple minutes. So that's the big idea behind Schema. It's really 2 things. This design tool that you use during feasibility and for block and stack to solve the partie of the building, and that's Skema AI. And we call it the first BIM knowledge reuse engine because we take Revit as input. It doesn't have to be Revit. We've taken SketchUp as input. We could take IFC as input. We could take ArchiCAD as input. The input to us doesn't matter as long as we understand what the relationships between the objects and what the graph is, so that we can then use that as a puzzle piece and have you use that in a design later. And I'll talk about what those puzzle pieces do. And then the idea there is whenever you come up with one of these finished block and stacks, and you can do as many options as you want, and it's just a browser-based application. So, you do this in a browser. There's nothing to install. The learning curve is very shallow. Once you get to this block and stack, then you say, look, show me what the BIM would look like for this. And we generate the BIM in a minute, and you can look at it and say, yeah, I like that. Or, oh, I wasn't expecting that. Let me go and change some things around and generate a new BIM preview and see what that looks like. And we do that in a piece of our solution called Schema BIM that generates the BIM from whatever you do in Schema AI. So these 2 things are sort of one holistic thing. When we show this at some of the upcoming events this summer, you're going to see this part has a Revit plugin, and you push and pull data from Revit to Schema in the cloud. And one of the big things about what we do is when we engage with the customer, we sign a non-disclosure agreement, because if they want to do a school, what we're going to say is, give us 2 completed schools you've done, and then we're going to harvest, basically classroom layouts, cafeteria layout, whatever layout from that school to build them a catalog that they use as the puzzle pieces for doing a new school. And we don't train an AI on their data. Like if we wanted to train an AI on their data, we would need thousands and thousands and tens of thousands and millions of projects. We don't do that. We have pre-trained pattern recognition tools that will look at their Revit data and help us scale this catalog building process as we get more and more companies doing this. But we don't share one architect's data with any other architect. So whatever standards you develop will end up in the Revit files we produce, but they're not just put into a cloud and shared with everybody. So it's not like you lose control over whatever special sauce you have as a firm. But it is why when you make Revit models out of Schema, they look like the Revit models that you've made out of Revit, because we're using the assemblies and the wall types and the door types and the furniture, fixture, and equipment, all the stuff that you've developed as BIM best practices over the last 15 years or so. For us, we have a conceptual design part of the software that's similar to other things. This is kind of table stakes. So we have, push-pull mass modeling that's very similar to SketchUp. or any of the other tools out there that do mass modeling in a web browser. We have sustainability analysis. We have some integrations with other sustainability tools like Cove Tool. The main thing about us is once you get to the mass, and we're working on projects now where you can take, say, a mass in Rhino and pull that in, or a mass in SketchUp and pull that in. Because really where we want to shine is this idea of fitting the pro forma into that mass to resolve the block and stack and the way that works. So for us, the number one requested feature from all of the current, what we call pioneer users of the software, is this design catalog manager. So when we bring in Revit, we look at a chunk of the building and we capture what we call the graph. The graphs are in your BIM data. So we have the layout of all the spaces and the things that they contain, and then the sort of envelope that encloses that, whether it's a demising wall or an exterior wall or an interior wall that connects to circulation, we capture that relationship and store that in a database. And then when you use Skema, those are the puzzle pieces that you see in the interface that we will use generators to lay out to give you an initial solve, and you can take whatever we do and move it around. So for instance, when you zoom in on these the puzzle pieces here are on the left-hand side. And after you use a generator to solve them, you'll get a layout that shows you, all right, here's, the corridor space, and here's the layout for, in this case, it's a residential building, so it's a multifamily. And the puzzle pieces can contain things like these exterior balconies and whatnot to vary the facade. And you might get to a situation where you have a corner that's not what you have here in the catalog, where we actually deform the units to actually make them work with this type of layout. So just because you had something that was a certain size and shape in a previous Revit project doesn't mean that it always has to be that size and shape in your future project. We have what we call the morphing tools that will then take stuff that you have, and based on constraints that we store in the catalog, change the size, shape, and layout to be sort of infinitely flexible in future situations. So that's the idea behind that. And that's the main thing, because you can say, look, I know that I have these square things, but I want to do a different facade on this, and I want to have this variation in the facade. So I'm going to take all of these and morph them into these new shapes. That's what the conceptual tool and the schematic design layout supports. You'll see what it looks like in Revit, because there's a Revit version of the catalog that is synchronized with our version of the catalog in Skema here. And then once you generate the building in Skema, we can then generate the Revit model from it. So roughly speaking, just to summarize, you take things that you have in a Revit model, you turn those into items that we manage in a catalog. Those items in our user interface are in a left-hand sidebar that shows you all the different pieces and parts you have from a previous project. In working with principals, they think about these things as they're talking to someone who wants to do a new project. They think, oh, this is similar to this project I did 10 years ago. So we're giving the ability just to borrow from that. We have initial solvers that'll do initial layout. If you don't like what we did and you wanted to do something different, you can just drag and drop things straight out of the design catalog. You can block things out like a stair core and say, I'm not going to figure that out right now. I'll do that later in Revit. Anything that you do on one floor can become a template for other floors. So we'll just say, copy this up to the second floor, but now I'll come and change these out so that these things are actually now going to be different layouts that are morphed to this different condition because I want a different facade on this back wall. No matter what you do, we're going to track the analytics as you work, so you can see where you are from the targets that you've agreed with the owner. Whenever you get to a resolved layout in Skema, you can generate the Revit data, and then the Revit data is very complete, high quality Revit data for whatever you've produced in Skema. And we generally do this in 1 to 2 minutes, depending on the complexity of the project. And so that's the core value proposition. The idea is you can do the initial schemes very quickly in Skema, present them to the owner so that you can go after projects in much less time. But one of the things that we found is that principals at architecture firms that are doing this, that know that whatever they do in Skema is going to produce valid data in Revit. So they know that when they solve the partie in Skema, they're not going to have to go and spend 8 weeks putting it into Revit only to find that it doesn't fit. The level of confidence they get talking to the owner, it makes a big difference in the conversation, because the owner says, all right, well, how long is it going to take for you to figure out whether that really fits? They go, no, we know it really fits. If we tell you this is the units you're going to get if we go with the scheme, we're confident these are the units you're going to get. So it changes that early conversation with the owner to the point where it's made a difference in the way that the architect is able to converse with the owner with a level of certainty about the project that they didn't have before.
Okay,
I
I do
don't
have
know.
a few questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so there's a catalog of like
Yeah.
Revit rooms and layouts, but you
Yeah.
mentioned that currently it's kind of a people are privately sending them to you. So is the process automatic? Do we have to go through your human team, if put it this way, or
Yeah,
is the
so
process automated?
next week we are announcing the catalog manager that allows a BIM manager, say at a firm, to create the catalog themselves.
Okay.
So up until now, from when we launched last June at the AIA show until next week, you would have had to go through our team and we would take the Revit data and help you build the catalog because
Mhm.
it was not a user. It was we had tools to do it, but they weren't something that we would give to a customer. And we got requests from all the designers saying, no, we want to control the inputs to what happens in Schema so that we have full control over all of the design elements. And so that's what we're delivering in an announcement next week, where we're going to announce this Schema design catalog manager that allows all of the current customers to shepherd this process themselves, independent of us. Like we'll still help you, if you want a Schema account and work with us as a pioneer, we'll still help you build your catalog because we're experts at it, but you're no longer dependent on us to do that.
And
And
how does that happen? In do you have to go in Revit, for example, and say like, okay, this is an apartment type A, this is apartment type B,
yeah,
and
generally
is
you're
it
going to have
complex to create this catalog?
anybody doing this kind of design typically has layouts that they've reused. Those are
Hmm.
either done through linked files or groups.
Yeah, yeah.
And we will just look at what those are. If you don't have them, you can simply group a bunch of stuff and then tell us that's the group that you want to turn into a chunk. But it's essentially a mapping of um, group things in Revit that turn into chunks of buildings in Schema.
Hmm.
The difference is that if you tried to do this in Revit yourself, Revit will fight you. Like this is the problem of mirroring the whole apartment units or
Yeah.
having common walls where you don't want double walls using Revit groups. It's just hard because the change engine in Revit is going to try and make wall joins happen and do other things. And
Hmm.
so
Yeah.
what we do is by taking that out of Revit, doing a separate exercise in Schema, and then just basically shoving the whole result of that back into Revit in one transaction, we can keep the change engine from like throwing a million warnings and complaining all day while you're trying to make those edits. So we've just given a lighter weight environment for you to do what you would like to do in Revit, but Revit fights you with. But then in the cases like the double demising walls and all, so we've solved that because we've approached the Revit data generation a different way that just makes more sense when you have this type of
Yeah.
application.
Okay. And what part is it using AI here? Is it like through the massing? Is it the way that it's
Yeah,
gonna
so
gonna
there's
using
a
contract?
couple yeah, there's a couple things that use different pieces of AI that and AI is a big bucket for all kinds of stuff.
Yeah. Sure.
Um, I sort of described this when I was talking about the process. There are graphs in your data. We pull them into a catalog. Right now, there's sufficiently few of them that it's not overwhelming. Part of what we're doing with AI is having machine learning look at the patterns in those graphs so that when you're looking at much more complicated solves, so the very simple solve is an apartment building solve. It's like one line, it's a double load a quarter. When you get into solves that are like a two-level solve in a hospital where you have to first solve departmental adjacencies and then you have a network of connected corridors and then you have puzzle pieces that are actually interlocking where the two shapes are joined together and they have to be adjacent to one another and you're trying to figure all that out. Those are much more complicated solves. That's when we rely more on machine learning to get us to the initial solves where we present to the user, these are probably your four or five best approaches. Which one do you want to go with for this particular option? So that's part of what we're in the middle of. So right now we've been just collecting data and working with customers to understand the use cases around solving the partie. And so that's the first case is using machine learning to suggest to the customer the most optimal solve as they're working in Schema. The second is when we find a situation where the unit is not the same size and shape as a space we have available, like here in this space here, where we're going to stretch this quarter out. And now we've got something that doesn't match anything we have here. then we have this morphing algorithm, and that is itself not our own AI. That is an open source Google AI library that's used to morph those types of patterns into new patterns. So there's really two places. There's one in the applying the catalog to the generative solve. That's one place for use of machine learning. And then the other is in the actual morphing of units to different sizes and shapes, where we do the, so unlike Revit groups where they all have to be the same, here they just have to rhyme, right? They have a logic to the layout, and they can be all different shapes and sizes depending on whether you decide you want to morph one to a new size and shape. How we then manage that data is different, because you could apply then a number of different construction approaches. If you want to be strictly modular, you may not want to change all of those just every time for every unique condition. You might want to have some amount of repetition, but we don't want to prescribe that strategy to the architect. We want to give them enough flexibility to do what they need to do while just making it easy to reuse what they have.
Yeah, and so are people, so your schema is doing that and then exporting to Revit. So is it then quite easy to move things around? Because we know with these kind of tools, typically you can get quite close to what you're looking for, but it's never quite exactly right. So
and this is the issue with generators. Like, there's always these edge conditions that somebody who built the script didn't think of, right? And so we think that this is, McKinsey did a study of applying modular construction to various building types, and everything in the overall process of delivering a building got faster except design. Because the designers now had to think about the means and methods of the execution of the modular system that they were going to use. And so design slowed down. What we're trying to do is not have design slow down, but produce data that could be used in a different delivery process. And it's an interesting seesaw. So for us, it's a matter of, we're not trying to solve 100% of the building. We're trying to solve, we think of ourselves as a fast forward button, so that we're the fastest way for you to get to 50 or 60% complete. If you're doing an apartment building, you're still going to have a podium, and that podium is going to have amenities and entries and all sorts of stuff that you're just going to want to go into Revit and do those custom for that project. But that doesn't mean that we can't just apply this to the apartment bar and save you a whole bunch of time not having to lay all that stuff out. So there's always some repetition on these projects. I was in last fall, I was on a panel with Karenza Harris of Morphosis, and she was showing this wonderful museum entry that they had done in CATIA. And somebody asked her about, well, could Skema have been used on that project? And he said, well, the front part was really custom, and yeah, we did it in CATIA, but the rest of it was fairly standard stuff back of house. And yeah, you probably could do something like that in a different type of tool. So you'll find that a lot of buildings have very similar guts, right? And we're good at the guts, but we're not going to force you to do everything in our tool. We're going to be a node in an ecosystem of web apps that run in a browser that are connected using data in a lossless way, as opposed to very lossy file exchanges where people have to do lots of data wrangling. That's the way that we think about it.
So there's a question that multiple people in the chat have been asking. What about MEP? So is this a strictly architecture for now?
Yeah, for us, Schema is MEP, and that's the whole point. Schema is not MEP. Schema is architectural scope. And so we've done a couple different things because so our goal is whatever you do in Schema, in minutes, you get a Revit model out of it. And even if you don't know how to use Revit. So we've had principals at firms generate these Revit models, but these are architectural models. However, because we have the higher order layout of the building, and we know, for instance, where core locations are, where circulation is, where demising walls between these units are, those demising walls are attractors, say, for vertical support in a structural system. Those core locations are attractors for shear walls in a structural system. So one of the things that we did that we showed in the suite at AU last year was an integration we did with Thornton Tomasetti, which I'll just bring up and play for you, where we take the same Jello cubes that we use to generate the architectural scope, and we pass them over to a machine learning stack that Thornton Tomasetti has called Asterisk. And what they do is we generate the architectural scope from these Jello cubes, but what TT does is they have Asterisk generate the steel frame from this. So for instance, in this case, they've taken these positions, the core locations, the demising walls between the units, They've inferred where all the column locations are. They've created a stick figure for the primary support. They, knowing the building use, have done a loading model for it, distributed the loads, assigned all the members, sized all the members, and then just sent it back to us so that we can display the result. This is the initial pass. This is not what you're going to take the permit. This is just something that you can get sized data so that, for instance, if you wanted to lay out MEP, you know how likely the beam depth is going to be that you have to miss with the duct or miss with the pipe so that you can do good routing in an automated way for MEP. We do not see, it's not our goal to be the Uber platform that does every piece of scope. We're going to do a really good job at solving the block and stack and the partie generation in this environment. And then we're going to work with partners to use AI to generate other things. So we're choosing to work with Thornton Tomasetti and their Aster stack on the structural generation. We're doing a project with Augmenta to take the result of both of those and turn that into MEP generation. So I see this connected ecosystem of apps as a very important development in allowing the designer to understand the implications of their choices. Because right now, it would be very difficult for you, for instance, to say, where should I put this mechanical room to minimize the amount of electrical branch conduit in this facility that I'm designing? It's like impossible question to answer. But with what I just described, you could ask that question and actually get an answer in a reasonably short amount of time. So it opens up some feasibility study, design study possibilities that aren't possible right now without these generative tools that are linked together in a lossless data web services kind of way. And anything that has file-based transactions where you've got to do lots of data wrangling just makes it beyond mere mortals to be able to do it. And that's the way that we're thinking about, our contribution to the ecosystem. We're not going to try and build everything, but we're going to work with partners in order to build those things. I think I just closed the.
All right. Yeah, no problem. So yeah, that does bring me a question. So if I get this right, you get the catalog, and then you go to Skema, you get the party, as you say, and then you can export to Revit, to BIM. So after you export, is your work done with Skema, or is there a back and forth where you can bring back some of the data back to Skema, where it's kind of a one way?
Yeah, right now we're thinking of ourselves not as a collaboration platform, but as a fast forward button. So we do have a multi-user aspect in that if you've got a project and you want to make 5, 6 options, different people can work on all those simultaneously without having to, close an option and get out of the option before somebody else does. You can work simultaneously on different options of the same project. When you push things to Revit, then we're really in the Revit domain and multi-users there. As far as going back and forth from Revit to Skema, that's a workflow that we intend to support. We're not in the habit of wanting to write a whole brand new model federation and version controlling layer.
Yeah, sure.
Our approach here is to do an integration with Speckle and use Speckle as a platform that allows us to do that model federation and version control. It's something we're working on now. I don't have an announcement about it, but these things are. Our R&D teams know each other, so it's a fairly straightforward thing to do. So all of those workflows are things that we plan to support.
Yeah, shout out to the Speckle team. They came here. Matteo came here 2 years ago now, so maybe we're due for another session. Yeah, it's a great tour. I love Speckle. Yeah, there's a lot of good question in there. Pretty good one from Ethan Hunt. What if you're starting from scratch and do not have a catalog to work with?
Yeah, so and this is part of people just seeing Schema for the first time and they just want to get started and see what it works like. So one of the things that we're releasing when we do the announcement next week is just a bunch of demonstration projects where we have a demonstration catalog that you can use just to test drive the thing. So of course, because it's a mandatory thing, we'll have an apartment building, but we'll also have a school. And we'll see how many building types we can put together by the time we release it. But I can show you, this is the demo project for the residential. So when the way that you invoke the catalog is you actually go to a floor and edit. So I mean, if I just give you a little tour about what this project is, there's a podium. It's got some parking in it. You can kind of see the stall layout of the parking section. And then there is a multi-height retail and an office component, and then there's a residential component on there. And if we go to the key figures, you can kind of see the unit layout, and then the stall mix in the parking area, and then the total mix of all the different space in the entire facility. So as you work, we track all these things. And you can, there's sort of a pivot table function where you can do your own kind of analysis if you want to look at things in a different way. But the question was about what if you don't have a catalog? So basically, we're including these demo catalogs, and you can work with those. And mainly, architects that are going to use this, they have Revit data or they have some other BIM kind of data, unless they've been hand drafting for the last 15 years, in which case, I guess we'll help you build some catalog data. The way that this is organized is that when you tab, at the top level, you have the building, and that would be the whole project. As you keep tabbing, you go to the block, which is a part of the building, and then the floor, which is part of the block. If I highlight that and I hit edit, that puts me into an edit mode. So think of this as in-place family edit mode, but inside Skema. And so now I'm editing this floor inside Skema. So now I'm looking at, as I'm mousing over, I'm highlighting the puzzle pieces. So if I zoom around to this side, so you might see, okay, I've got a big apartment unit here. I've got the core location here. That's a dead end corridor. What am I going to do about that? Well, like I said, these are magnetic puzzle pieces. So I'll just pick this one up. I'll stick him over here for a minute. I'll take the core, and I'll take this core and just say, why don't I stick you over here? Now you see this down at the bottom, there's this little white dot in the corner. So I haven't picked that corner, but I'm near enough that it's saying, okay, that's the magnetic snap that I'm using to align myself with other things. So now I've got a precise orientation there. Like it's not eyeballed. I've actually snapped to the demising wall of this other unit. And so now I can bring this back in here. And again, if I grab it near that corner and I get that white dot, I'll now snap it here. And so now I've redone this floor so that I've moved the core down so I don't have a dead end corridor. If I now say save, what you'll see is this floor is a template for all the other floors. It's going to update all the floors. And now on all the floors, I've moved the corridor over, the core, right? And now I have a different layout that I've applied to all the floors. So you kind of get the idea, right? We've got these puzzle pieces. We have solvers that will lay out the puzzle pieces for you based on pro forma. And then if you want to do something different, you can just grab a puzzle piece, drag and drop it into the editor, delete something, put something in its place. If you don't like a puzzle piece, you just draw a mass and say morph, this unit to that mass, and it'll stretch and pull the puzzle piece.
Someone asked in the chat if you can edit the catalog yourself. So I can see the catalog.
Yes.
Can you go into edit mode and move?
As of today, no. As of
Mhm.
next week of our announcement, yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I see. Yeah. There's still.
It's done using a Revit plugin. So basically, the way that catalog works is you will have a Revit file that contains a project with all the groups in that catalog, and then that is synchronized with the catalog definition in the cloud that turns it into these reusable puzzle pieces. And then through that plugin, you also then pull the data back into Revit. So we have a Revit export function up here, which I have to save and exit in order to access it. So right now we're directly exporting to Revit from this editor in order to respond to some customer feedback about, well, what if we wanted to push that to ACC or save it to this other place? We're going to allow you to do it as inside Revit in a Revit plugin, so you can pick whatever path Revit's normally used to talking to put that data. So we don't actually exchange files. We do this with a push and a pull through web services. So in that way, we don't have a file-based workflow, but we do have to deal with Revit, which still does have a file-based workflow.
A question from Roger asking, how is Skema differentiating itself from Forma? So from what I understand, it's really the customization of all the units that I don't think Forma has.
Yeah, I mean, right? Forma doesn't solve the partie for a building. So, if I go to these key figures, I think you can do blocks for these things, but Forma is not going to generate a complete Revit model at LOD 300 of this layout. Like if I go and I generate a Revit model, so this is a Revit model from an actual project. And you can see kind of like it's ready to go. Like if I were to take the groups in this file and the linked Revit models in this file and just bind them and explode them, somebody would say they wouldn't be able to tell that it wasn't drawn in Revit by someone by hand. In fact, this project is a podium that was drawn manually in Revit and an apartment bar that was generated in Schema combined via two linked files. So yeah, it's the main difference between us and Forma is that Forma is a urban master planning tool with something that allows you to chop up the floors to turn them into a block and stack, but it is not nearly, in our opinion, as proficient in the block and stack and the Revit data generation as we are, and we intend to be best in class in those two areas.
So what I see here, what part of the model has been generated with Schema?
The apartment bar. So
the apartment.
Not the podium, but the apartment bar.
So you're using, in this case, you're using model groups?
Yes. Right. So in this case, and depending on whether you deliver these things modularly or not, if you do modules where you have structural chassis as part of the module, then you do get double demising walls because you need to stack chassis next to each other. Or if you're doing, say, site built or panelized, then you're not going to have double demising walls. You're going to have single demising walls. So we can do either case depending on what the strategy of the firm is. In this case, you see the double demising walls for a modular strategy.
Mm-hmm. Yes, something interesting that I could see this solving is all the versioning in Revit. It's always an issue. You keep files in Revit 2021. So I guess in your case,
yes,
that's kind of dealt with within the Schema software, right? So you don't have this constant upgrading and things being deprecated.
Right.
Who are your clients? Are you working with lots of modular people, or just
no? Well, we specifically went after the architectural community because we think in order for us to stick in the market, architects have to love using it. Mm-hmm. So a customer of ours we've talked about a lot is TVS Design in Atlanta. We've been working with them for about a year now. Other customers we work with are OPN Architects out in the Midwest, LPA Design out in Southern California. There's a number of them on our website, so you can see some of the companies that have been working with it. At any point in time, maybe 20 to 25% of our sales prospect pipeline are developers that are looking at this as something that could be strategic for the way they deliver buildings, and not just housing developers. We've had data center owners, medical facility owners, come and say, could I do a data center with this? And our answer is always, yeah, you can do whatever you want with it, as long as we have groups in Revit that can be used for something like a data unit or a power unit or whatever. So, yeah, we, like I said, we launched it last June. So we've been in the market 9 months.
Yeah.
And it's but we're replaying some of the early Revit playbook. We had at the Revit startup, we had a dozen very important customers. In Schema, we call those the pioneer customers, and we have a very special partner relationship with them, and they're very honest with us about the feedback, and that's the way that we get the product market fit, where we don't build the wrong product for the market. So our goal is to have architects love the product. There have been plenty of companies that have built like modular systems and try and get architects to use them, and the architects hate them. We want the architects to love using this, and that's our goal. Our goal is to compete with trace paper. We want a principal who says, hey, this is similar to a project I did 10 years ago. Can I just start with it? To say, yeah, I'll just do that in Schema versus, yeah, I'll just draw something out in trace paper. But
okay, that's a couple more questions. Javier asks, is there also a 2024 plugin for Revit?
Not at this time. There will be, though.
Okay.
That's just a matter of time. We had a little bit of uncertainty around the data format of 2024, and so we didn't get a whole lot of demand right away for it.
Sure. Ethan asks, can you show the CATIA project you mentioned, or any other example of a project that does not look like a typical Revit building?
I cannot, because it's under NDA.
Hmm.
However, I think I just got verbal approval to show it at Next Build. So
Okay.
well, we'll see what happens. But yeah, there are examples where you could take the LOD 200 you see here, and instead of generating Revit, take the relationships and go straight to, say, references in a CATIA engineering template and flex things that way. There's a lot of possible workflows. So we're still at the beginning of the journey. We haven't implemented, all of them, or probably not even nearly half of them yet. So
There's a good question from Jeff Turvo asking, how precise of models can Schema produce? Can you set the precision in Schema so that you don't get odd dimensions in Revit, such as avoiding 1/16 of an inch dimension in Revit? Yeah, that's the kind of problem you see if you take like a SketchUp model and you try to
yeah,
bring it to Revit, and it's kind of odd dimensions here and there.
yeah, and the only answer I can give to that question is garbage in, garbage out. If you've got bad dimensions in the groups that we suck in and turn into puzzle pieces, you're gonna have bad dimensions. So there is a little bit of a quality control aspect to this. There are BIM managers at firms, though, that see this as an opportunity to make best practices easier to use than doing it with bad practices. In that, if the catalog in Schema has well-dimensioned chunks with good sustainable materials and all the proper, things that you want to schedule out, then it's going to be those are what show up in the projects, right? So there's an opportunity to foster best practices with this workflow. Uh, and if we have to, I guess we could figure out ways to put agents in here and traffic cop like, bad dimensions, but we haven't resorted to that yet.
Okay, so if people want to get started with Schema, how can they do it?
Yeah, I mean, you can go to our website and sign up for a trial. I think I have this is probably not the right QR code, but it is a QR code down here. So we're at Skema.ai. You can go and check us out there. You can email info@Skema.ai. We have a LinkedIn that you can check out as well. If you do go to the website, there's lots of blog posts and in the support area, a whole knowledge base. And there's a whole bunch of videos around all the sort of different workflows that we put in response to user questions about they're what we call the Ask Alex series. Hold on, I'm going to turn on my power so my computer doesn't die. Here we go.
Okay. Uh, nice. Let's see if there are any more questions. Uh, MB asks, what about different building standards and roles that we'll take into consideration? So different building standards. So I guess the key points with you, it's starting from the catalog. So you just need to get good catalog data from whatever standards you're using, and what
Yeah.
Schema produces is going to be based on that. Is that right?
Yeah, so generally speaking, we're not trying to be an expert system that checks the architect's work. We're expecting that things that you've designed and successfully built in the past are close enough to what you're trying to do again, that they're buried into the Revit data that we're harvesting. That said, the catalog functionality does have constraints in it, so that as we stretch a unit, if you say this should never be shorter than 6 feet or 2 meters or whatever, you can set those constraints so that as we change the shapes of things, they respect code minimums and clearances. But that is up for the architect to be the expert in. We're not going to try and embed that kind of knowledge into this yet, although there are code checking applications that we may interface with at an API level in order to do that kind of checking work in the future if we get a lot of requests for it from the customers.
Okay, I think, okay, let this be the final questions. Are you mostly working with LOD 200 groups and blocks?
No, we mostly work with LOD 300 data coming out of Revit. We abstract it into LOD 100 and 200, so it's easy to work with in a web browser environment at a whole project level. But our goal is to then get right back to LOD 300. We also have a plan of getting to LOD 400. So a lot of what these generators that the original team built were actually construction modeling generators that dealt with LOD 400 data. And there's a couple different ways to get to LOD 400 data. You can take the LOD 200 high order understanding of where the interfaces between chunks of buildings are and use those with something like an engineering template in CATIA to be able to instantiate those chunks at an LOD 400 assembly level, which is a whole separate call. Or you can generate the LOD 300 data in Revit and use a tool that then maps Revit families and instances to a construction assembly. An example of a tool like that would be COPE. And then there are others that do things like that by mapping LOD 300 assemblies into LOD 400 supplier orderable assemblies. So there's two different strategies to get to construction, but the whole point of doing the LOD 100 and 200 stuff is to accelerate the creation of the LOD 300 and 400 data in an organized way that doesn't produce chaos, and then have web services data exchanges that don't produce the data loss that the file-based exchanges do today.
Okay, let's go with a real final question from Lee.
Sure.
Do you always need a Revit catalog of models to work from, or could you use an Excel file, data-rich schedule to help create a catalog directly in Skema? So from what I understand, for now, it's, the catalog is made from Revit. Do you have plans that
It doesn't have to be Revit. Like I said,
No, okay.
we've taken input from SketchUp, we've taken input from any number of tools, but generally what we want is some 3D modeling data. Whatever we take in is what we're going to push out.
Yeah,
we
sure.
we maintain the mapping of what we've turned into a puzzle piece back into whatever it's going to be in a BIM system. So generally we need some BIM data in. We're not just people have done blocking and stacking in Grasshopper for I don't know how many years now, a long time. The problem there is then they have to take that and reproduce it in Revit, which typically takes like 8 weeks and introduces a lot of variance. And then what they get in Revit doesn't match the block and stack. So we're trying to avoid that whole problem of introducing variance by having people work in Revit to recreate what was in the block and stack. And the way we do it is by taking the BIM data in so that we can systematically push it out. So yeah, we do need some BIM data as a starting point.
All right. I think that's it for the questions. So any final word or final request to the audience? Final things you wanted to mention?
Yeah, I think first off, thanks for having me on the show. It was really fun to be here. Take a look at Skema. We're happy to answer your questions. There is an in-product training that will walk you through building something in Skema in like 15 minutes. So do check it out. We are also going to be at several events. We will be attending ENR Future Tech. We will have people at the AI show, but we won't have a booth. We'll be at Next Build and Next Dev in London. So if you are reach out to us, certainly through email or LinkedIn or just on our website, and we're happy to talk to you. And if you want to see us in person, you can catch us at those events.
Oh yeah, you're gonna be at the Next Bill event.
Yes.
I had Martin Day last fall talk to us about like the state of AI.
Yeah. No, I
and
watched a bit of that to understand what
okay.
the show was about. So that was great.
Yeah, sure. Okay, I think that's it for today. So let me take a minute to thanks to our sponsor, Enscape. Thanks for sponsoring the entire season of BIM Pure Live. And next week, we're going to be live with Howard Vasog to talk about Anchor and to validate BIM data on the cloud. That's going to be fun. Always fun times with Howard. And just one final thing. Give me a sec here. And our collections of Red Doors being released on Monday. So just go to bimpure.com. You'll see this. You can get on a wait list. It's part of our membership. So thanks a lot, Marty, for accepting the invitation and showing this great tool.
Thanks, Nicola.
And thanks for everyone in the chat once again for being there and asking great questions. So we'll see you next week. Bye.